Okay. I might just pray and then start. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you that you reveal yourself, your character, and all the things that you want us to know in your word. And so I pray that as we read this book today, that you would help us grasp the main things that you want us to understand about who you are and what it means to be your people. In Jesus' name. Amen. By the way, since as we won't be meeting next week at Easter, I brought chocolate. So, help yourself to chocolate. We're looking at the book of Numbers this week, and we call it Numbers in our English version, but in the original, in the Hebrew, this book is called In the Wilderness. So in the English version, we call it Numbers simply because there's a census at the beginning and there's a census at the end. And they count all the people of Israel in those two different censuses. But the actual point of this book is to show us what Israel's journey from Sinai to the point where they're going to enter the promised land. And so it actually reflects on Exodus. And so you'll see that, that there's a similar pattern to what happened in Exodus. So there's, they start at Sinai, whereas in Exodus they finished at Sinai. And then they go towards the promised land. Exodus tells us the story of Israel coming out from Egypt to Sinai, and then this is from Sinai to the promised land. And the first few chapters paint us a picture of what the ideal is of God's people living in the presence of God. Because remember, in the last couple of books, so at the end of Exodus, the tabernacle had been constructed and the glory of God filled it, but the people or the priests couldn't go in because there was no ability for them to go in. With Leviticus, we see the need for the sacrificial system and for the atonement of sin, specifically in the Day of Atonement. And once that system is in place, then the priests are able to go in and out of the tabernacle. And so there is access. But as we said before, there are these concentric circles of holiness that kind of go from the most holy to completely unclean. And so what Numbers gives us is this tension of human, simple people living in the presence of a holy God. And what happens when they sin, basically because they're going to be sinning all the time. And so Numbers gives us the account of this simple people and how God deals with them as they're meant to be his people, living with him in his presence. And so initially we have this census, and so we've got named all of the tribes and how many people there are, and it doesn't count all the people. It only counts the able men from the age of 18 up. Let me double check that. They're all 20. So anyone who's age 20 up and able to go to war, they're the ones that are listed. And this helps us prepare for the idea that they are actually preparing to go into the promised land. And what they're going to be doing is they're going to go in and conquer the land. And so there's this idea that there is a spiritual battle against idolatry that they're about to go and kind of be part of. And so they list everyone from 20 years old and upward, every male, every 20 years and upward. So if we contrast that with the number of people who went to Egypt at the end of Genesis, where there were 70 people who went into Egypt, we're looking at 603,550 just purely males from the age of 20 up. So if we think about that, that there's probably almost an equal number of females, and then there's children as well. We're looking at least 1 million, if not more, people that are now coming out of Egypt and going to enter the promised land. So we can see there's a fulfillment of God's promise that he made in Genesis chapter 12, that he's going to make Abraham's descendant a large nation. So we can see this picture of a large nation, and then it goes into the idea and the importance of the firstborn, first of all, the Levites. And so these Levites actually were not counted along with the fighting people, because they are separate. If we remember, the Levites are the sons of Aaron, or the families, no, they're the families of Levi, from the tribe of Levi, some of whom are the sons of Aaron. And it explains what the duties of the Levites are. And if we look at chapter 3, verse 7, we can see that what the job of the tribe of Levi is to keep guard over the tent of meeting and over the congregation. So this tribe is like the mediating tribe between the presence of God and the people. And so when they describe the whole setup, let me use this as our as our picture. We've got the tabernacle in the middle, and then around the tabernacle we've got the tribes of Levi. Just count them in 4 sections, and so there's Aaron and his sons. They're closest to the door. And then there's the other guys that they're the ones who are like the furniture removalists of Israel and of the tabernacle. And so what they do is they carry, because this is like a tent structure, they carry it from place to place. And so some of them were in charge of just carrying the things from the Holy of Holies and the holy things. There's an altar, there's a table for bread, and there's the lampstand, and then there's the Ark of the Covenant. And so what the tribe of Aaron have to do, they have to cover all those things up, and then these guys are allowed to carry them on poles. And then you've got the fabric. So one tribe carries all the fabric stuff, and then there's the hardware, like the poles and the rods and stuff. The other tribe carries them, and they're actually allowed to be carried on carts. But the most holy things have to be carried on poles by hand. And so that was how that was established. So you've got the tribe of Levi in the closest to the center, which is the tabernacle. And then we've got 12 tribes all around. And so we've got 3 tribes on this side, 3 tribes on this side, 3 tribes on this side, and another 3 tribes on this side. So that's the 12 tribes. And so they're basically, you've got this big like circle around the very center, which is the tabernacle. And the way they were to march was the tabernacle, not the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant would go at the front. Then the Levites would go carrying all the bits and pieces, and then the tribe of Judah, and then the rest of the tribes would kind of fall in behind them. And then every time they stopped, they would set up in this configuration again. And now there were like a multitude from Egypt as well that were tagging along, and they were all around the outside of this. So as you can see, we get visualized that representation of the most holy things, the clean, dedicated priests and people dedicated to the service of God, and then the rest of the tribes, and then the ones that are kind of extra. They're not actually part of Israel, but they actually want to join in on this living in God's presence and participating in going into the land. So, and then outside of that is the desert, where, you know, it's ultimately a place of death. So you go from death to life as you get closer to the center. Yeah, have some more chocolate. Yeah, so we get this picture in the first few chapters of how this is all arranged and what the duties of each tribe, and particularly of Levi, is to do. And then in chapter 3, we get this idea of the importance of the firstborn, and that the firstborn is meant to be dedicated to God. But God has said, basically, instead of taking one firstborn from every family of Israel, he's actually going to use the tribe of Levi as a representative of those people. And so the tribe of Levi represents the firstborns. And so you get in chapter 3 from 40 to 51, this idea of replacing the firstborn of all of Israel with the whole tribe of the Levites. And when you look at the math, it almost works out as, you know, the number of Levites that they count up equals virtually really close to the number of firstborns. And so you get this representative of the firstborns, and they are dedicated to them. They're dedicated to working in his in the temple or in the tabernacle, and so their work is to tend to the holy things. And as I said before, we get this language of keep and guard. And where have we heard that language before? Yes, yeah. What was Adam had to do was keep and guard the garden. And so it's like the tribe of Levi is the new Adam, and they're keeping and guarding the place where God dwells. Yeah, so there's this, again, this picture of Israel as being in a new Eden, and this is like a new start for creation with God's people dwelling in his midst. But there's a problem, and so in chapter 5 we see that that people are unclean. And so there's this idea that you go from being unclean to clean, and then from clean you're purified to become whole. And so there's these steps that need to be taken so that you can participate in worshiping God and living, even just living in this section. And so if we look in chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, what they had to do, anything that was unclean, has to be put out of the camp. And so by the camp, we're talking about the structure of up into the 12 tribes of Israel, and then anything outside those, that's kind of outside the camp. And so that includes where the Gentiles are, the people from Egypt that have come along, any foreigners that are part of that. But then obviously there is a section where there are a whole bunch of people who are considered unclean. And so they're people that have got skin rashes or bodily discharges or things like that. And so there's this idea that anything that reminds us of death is unclean. And so that's why these bodily fluids that you do see in Leviticus and you see again here in Numbers, that these bodily fluids are unclean because they're fluids that normally provide life, but they're now outside the body, and so they represent death. So blood, for example, you've got the idea that if a woman is bleeding, then that blood, which would normally nurture life if there's a baby, has come out. And it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with her. She's not any more or less sinful, but the blood represents death because it's no longer associated with life or the giving of life. And so therefore, the time that that's going on, she needs to be outside. Now, so obviously there's going to be a section outside the camp where there's a whole bunch of women and that will rotate each time. Yeah, so there's going to be that section of the camp, and then there's going to be, well, maybe included in that section is going to be the women that have had babies, and for the however many weeks that they're still bleeding, because that still represents the same thing, that the blood that's being shared is not helping with the life anymore, like that's finished. And so you see all of those things represented at the end of Leviticus. And so if you think about just some of those things where bodily fluids make you unclean, it's this idea that instead of being part of what brings life, it's now represents death because it's no longer doing what it was purposed for. So there are a bunch of people that are actually outside the camp, but there are ways to help them get back in. And so they get purified and then they're able to participate again. And so this thing needs to be happening all the time. And it's just a reminder to them of how holy God is and how they really fall short, even not because they've done anything wrong. So none of these things that make you unclean are simple. Like having a baby is not simple. Being able to reproduce is not simple. It's just that it represents, there's this association with what is unclean. And so therefore you're excluded from where there is life. So anything that represents death is excluded from the presence of life. So God is so clear that he doesn't want his camp defiled. He can't be in the presence of a holy God if there's any contamination, because any contamination is going to cause God to God's holiness to break out against the people. Because he is holy. He can't stop being holy. And so when there's sin that enters God's presence, he can't abide. He can't be in that place. And so it has to be dealt with. And so there's this whole idea that things that make you unclean need to be outside, but then you can be purified. And so it is with not only the physical things that make you unclean, but the spiritual, emotional, like things that are going on in your heart that make you unclean and unworthy of God's presence. That is anything to do with sin. That also needs to be cleansed, which is why they need the sacrifices and the system. And so in chapter 7, you get this big section where they repeat over and over again how they offer up the offerings at the tabernacle. And so it's consecrated, and we get this picture of all these sacrifices and offerings, and it gets repeated over and over again, starting with the tribe of Judah. They offer a silver plate, and then they offer flour and oil, dishes, and incense, a bull, a ram, a lamb, and a goat, and oxen, goats, lambs for people. Like, so they go through those offerings that we talked about last week: the sin offering, the burnt offering, the sin offering, and the peace offering. And each tribe offers all these animals. And so then again, we get at the end of chapter 7 in verse 89, Moses is able to go into the tent of meeting to speak with the Lord. So God is able, Moses, and we can see that Moses is able to go all the way into the most holy of holies, because he's speaking to God above the mercy seat that was on the ark. And so he's gone right in, and it was just like on Sinai. Remember, Moses was able to go all the way up, but then the priests were only able to go so far, and the people could only go so far.
So would he have to go through that?
I think he would have had to. But it's almost like, it seems like, well, before he went up on Sinai, there were some sacrifices, but it's almost like God has declared him to be righteous. Yeah. I mean, I think that the sin offerings and all of that purify the whole people cover him as well. But it's like he's God's special representative, and unlike anyone else, he's able to enter God's presence in a way that no one else up to Jesus was able to do. So in that sense, he is like a forerunner of who Jesus is. It's a representative of Jesus, because Jesus is able to enter the most holy place. Because he's completely sinless, Moses isn't completely sinless. And so then we see that they celebrate the Passover and the cloud. We get a description of the cloud in chapter 9. And so what happens with the cloud? The cloud, this presence of God, where it basically, God leads them. And so if it comes up, then they're to pack up the camp and move along. And then when it stops, that's where they're to set up the next camp. And so in that way, God leads them around, and we see repeated quite frequently, chapter 9, verse 18, at the command of the Lord, the people set out, and at the command of the Lord, they camped. And so we have this picture of God's people celebrating with God, with all these feasts. They celebrate the Passover, they do all the sacrifices. There's this communion with God, and that this is a life living in the presence of God. It's fearful, but it's also wonderful. And so the first few chapters are basically lead us to this point where they finally leave Mount Sinai. So basically, in Exodus, they leave Egypt and they get to Sinai, which is probably about a few weeks time frame. And then they're at the base of Mount Sinai for about a year. So this Passover, this is the first Passover since they came out of Egypt. So that's a time stamp for us that it's been a year. And so just after they've done all this celebrating, it says in the second year, in the second month, chapter 10, verse 11, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle and the people of Israel set out from the wilderness of Sinai. And so we get a few verses here that lead us or lead the people to a place in the wilderness that they're heading towards the promised land. And so we get this at the beginning in verse 11 and 12, this idea that the people are setting out when the cloud lifts. And then in verse 35, at the end of chapter 10, we see that this is what God says about God's presence. Moses basically, each day, every time the ark sets out, Moses says, chapter 10, verse 35, "Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you." So basically he's saying, God, go before us and make sure that none of your enemies are able to touch your protected people. And then when the cloud settles and the ark is resting, he basically says, "Return, Lord, to the thousands, 10,000 thousands of Israel." And so God is enclosing them in his presence. He is scattering their enemies before them and he is protecting them. So there's this picture of God being with his people and protecting his people and leading his people. So we have God leading his people, and there's this expectation that God is there, he's with them. What can go wrong? And then we find out immediately what can go wrong. The people is what go wrong, and they complain. And where have we heard this before? In Exodus. As soon as things get difficult for them, they complain. And we see that they've got there's a rabble amongst them that have greedy desires and cause everyone to wish they were back in Egypt, even though they're the picture of Egypt that they've got is not actually very accurate, because they imagine it as much nicer than it actually was. They've forgotten that actually they were slaves in Egypt and now they're free, that God has been providing for them, but they want things to be back the way they were in Egypt. If we have a look, in verse 4 and 5, they had a strong craving, and the people of Israel wept and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. Now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at." And then it tells us about the manna and how versatile and wonderful it actually is. it's like coriander seed, the appearance of gold, and the people about it gathered it and used it, and it's quite versatile. They can make cakes, they can do other things, they can beat it, they boil it. And so it's there every day, but they're weeping because they think that they want things that they're not satisfied with God's provision for them. Their desires are for things that are really imagined, because they might have had some of those things, but to say it costs nothing when you're a slave, not quite true. So they're not remembering well what's going on, and God is angry at them because they're complaining. They're complaining about the Lord. They're actually not crying out to God. They're just complaining. So we can see that there is a difference between when they cry out to God and when they just grumble and complain about God. And so it says in chapter 11, verse 1, and the people complained in the hearing of them. So they're actually not asking God, they're just complaining. And in comparison to Moses actually prays to God. And sometimes he prays and it sounds like he's complaining a bit too, but he's actually taking that to God. And there is a difference between just grumbling and actually saying, oh, this is how I feel, God. I'm bringing it to you because I know you can do something about it. So basically there is a lot of death that happens because they are continuing to not trust that God will look after them. And he says that he can provide for them, and he does give, he's already been providing them with manna, but then he brings them the meat that they crave. And if we think about what they do when they get this meat, they are so greedy. If we think about, if we have a look at chapter 11, verses 31 to 35, to 34 actually. So they've been asking for meat. God says, I'll provide. I will provide you with meat. And so he provides them with quail, but he's actually providing, but what he's providing is a judgment. So I think it's very fearful and very telling when God gives people what they want. Because when God gives people what they're wanting, it's nearly always a punishment, because they are wanting things that are not good and not right. And so we see that God does provide quail for them. And what do? In verse 32, they rose all that day and all night and gathered the quail. Those who gathered, at the least, gathered 10 homers. Now, not really sure. I don't know if either of you've got a.
Mine says that is possibly about 1 1/3
tons, like,
or about 1.6 metric tons.
yeah. So this is massive amounts of food, like way more than they actually could possibly need and eat, which is a description where it helps us think, okay, so they're actually, it's like, when your parents say your eyes are too big for your stomach. Like, they are just greedy. They are just greedy. They don't need this. They are just gathering it up. And basically they eat, and as soon as they eat it, they get sick. Because this is not, God is providing, but it's a judgment as well, because he's satisfying greedy desires And bless you. And so basically, while the meat was yet between their teeth, before it was even consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people. Makes me think, are they almost eating this more? Like, they're so greedy for it. It's like they're pulling it apart and trying to eat it without even waiting to, like you get this picture of them being really greedy. I'm not sure if that's exactly right, but that's the picture you get from this description. And so there's this section, there's tissues just over there, where there's just repeated opposition to God and people complaining, and even Aaron and Miriam complain. And so in chapter 12, we get this story about Aaron and Miriam wanting to have the same privileges that Moses has. And I think that we've talked before that when God has established how the order of things goes, and it's just like what we've been reading in Corinthians, there are different gifts and they're all for the building up of the church. It's not like one is more important than the other, but Moses does have this privilege. He is able to go and speak to God. But Aaron and Miriam want this. And it almost seems like Miriam, who gets punished more severely, is the instigator here. And that is like we want that same privilege that Moses has. And we're going to declare that we have that privilege in front of all the people. And then God says, okay, you think that you want to talk to me? You know that I've spoken to you. I'm going to speak with you. And he talks to them. Chapter 12, verse 6. He said, this is God to Aaron and Miriam, hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him. In a vision, I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord is kindled against them. So when they're speaking against Moses, they're actually speaking against God. Yeah, and so again, we see here that Moses is like a representative of what Jesus is going to be. And he has this privilege where he is able to be in God's presence, that he has the authority that God has given him to speak God's word, and that he hears God's word faithfully as well. And so this is ordained by God. And how can Aaron and Miriam actually disagree with that? They're like, basically they're saying, well, we know better. And so it is with all the sin, just like Adam and Eve have decided they knew better and would decide that they were going to do their own thing. This is exactly what Aaron and Miriam do, and they get punished. But what does Moses do? Moses intercedes for them, and he pleads for God. Then this chapter 13 and 14 are kind of very important. Like out of all the chapters in Numbers, these are probably central in importance because they basically explain why Israel ends up in the desert for 40 years. Because we get to the end of we get to the beginning of chapter 13, and they're right here. They're at the edge of the land, they're ready to go. It's been a couple of weeks since they left Sinai, so it's only been a year since they left Egypt, or just a bit over a year. And here they are already at the promised land. And so God has promised them that he's giving them the land. And they get to go, and these 12 men get to go and look at the land. So they've only ever heard of the land being promised, and they're actually going to get to go into the land and have a look and see if what God has promised is actually true. And so God allows them, and it says here that they are to go out and spy the land and have a look at it and then see what it is. Verse 17, see what the land is and whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, whether they're few or many, whether the land that they dwell in is good or bad, whether the land is rich or poor, whether there are trees or not, and bring some of the fruit. So they're going into the land remembering all the things that God has already promised, and they're going to check out and see if what God has promised is actually true. And so we get this description of the fruit of the land. So it says bring back some of the fruit, and they bring some grapes. And if we look at the description of the grapes, there's a branch with a single cluster of grapes. So it's just a cluster. And what did they have to do? They had needed, it was so big, they had to carry it on a pole between them, between two people. So two people have to carry this one cluster of grapes. So we get this picture of that God's promises are real, that they're true, that the land that he promised is as good as he said it was going to be. He said it was a land flowing with milk and honey, and here is the abundance of the land, more amazing than they probably would have imagined. Two people had to carry one cluster of grapes. And so they spy the land for 40 days. And in verse 27, they come back and they have the report. We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is the fruit. So basically they're saying, yeah, everything we've heard about the land is true. What God has told us is true, and it is good. And the provision of the land is amazing. However, and then there's the problem. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, the cities are fortified and very large, and we saw the descendants of Anak. Now these are the people that are basically like giant stature. They're really big. They are terrified of them. And so Caleb, who is from the tribe of Judah, so we've got kind of a leadership coming from Judah, just that little hints that Judah is going to take prominence and leadership. Caleb says, let us go up at once and occupy. So he's actually not worried about how fierce or big or whatever the people are. He trusts God and he says, we can do this. God has promised us this land, so let's do it. But the other guys are like, no, we can't do it. They're bigger and stronger than we are. And so they bring a bad report of the land, and basically they say it devours its inhabitants. So everyone gets all upset and afraid because instead of trusting God, who basically has shown them that he keeps his promises and what he's promised is good, they're not trusting that he is going to be able to give them the land that he promised. And this also helps us put into perspective some of what, I guess, some of the questions that people have about Israel conquering the land, in that they basically think about it as a large group of superior people conquering a small group of so like the English coming into Australia with weapons and conquering Aboriginal people who were weaker and didn't have, but were defenseless. Similarly, the Spanish going into America and conquering those lands with superior weapons and numbers. Whereas here we're looking, they're saying these guys in the land they are superior in strength and numbers to us. So we are actually not looking at a superior people trying to conquer an inferior people. We are looking at a small group, comparatively, of people going into a land that's well defended, that have superior, like they have weapons. That Israel don't have. Israel don't have weapons. They have chariots, they have walls, they have cities that are fortified. Israel doesn't have any of that. And so it helps us understand this picture, where people are like, well, Israel just committed genocide. It's not quite that way, particularly the way the Israelites see it at this point is like, they are way superior, they are way bigger, there is actually no hope for us. And so that helps us understand that this actually is a spiritual battle. It's God who is going to enable this, and it's actually clearing out idolatry from the land. And so they're all anxious and upset because this beautiful land is full of very fearsome and well fortified people who would eat them up if they tried to go in there, is basically the idea. And so, again, the people are grumbling and wishing that they were back in Egypt. So let's read, can someone read chapter 14, verse 2 and 3?
Yeah. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?
Right. So basically, they're thinking that being a slave in Egypt is better than being this amazing people of God, with God in the center of them. Like to dwell in God's presence is nowhere near as good as being a slave in Egypt. So their idea of what is good and right is completely warped. Yeah. And basically, we get Joshua and Caleb defending the land and defending the fact that God is actually capable of taking them into the land. And the people get so angry about that they try and stone them. If we see in verse chapter 14, verse 10, they were set to stone them, but then God's glory appeared, and they kind of stopped. So God protects his leaders and the people who defend him. And basically, he says to Moses, how long will this people despise me, and how long will they not believe in me despite all the signs I've done among them? And then he says, I'm going to disinherit them, I'm going to strike them down, very similar to what happened when they had the golden calf in Sinai. God is saying, you know, I'm going to start again with you, Moses, going to get rid of all these people. And Moses is, no, he defends the people, he intercedes for them, and he bases his intercession on God's promises and his power. And if we look at verse 17, it says, may the power of the Lord be as great as you have promised, that the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression. So this is exactly what God said to him in Exodus 34. And Moses is quoting back to God, this is who you are. So don't do this. And then God promises that he has pardoned. So in verse 20, the Lord says, I have pardoned according to your word. But as truly as I live, and all the earth shall be filled with the glory. So that that is a reminder that this is still God's program. And it doesn't matter what happens, this is still what he's going to do. The whole earth is going to be filled with the glory of God, in spite of what happens with Israel. But then he says, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs will go into the land. And it's interesting, if we look at, can you read someone read from 28 through to 35? Yes, chapter 14.
So tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you this very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness your bodies will fall, every one of you 20 years old or more, who is counted in the census and who is grumbled against. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But as for you, your bodies will fall in this wilderness. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering through unfaithfulness, until the last of your bodies lies in the wilderness. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explore the land, you will suffer for your sins, and know what it is like to have me against you. I, the Lord, have spoken, and I will surely do these things to this whole wicked community, which has banded together against me. They will meet their end in this wilderness. Here they will die.
Okay, so remember what they said? We wish we'd died in the wilderness. You want what you use. You know, when God gives people what they want, it is judgment. So basically, you know, you said you wish you died in the wilderness. Well, you are going to die in the wilderness. You wish you were going to go back to Egypt. Well, we're going to turn around, and instead of going into the land, you're actually going to go almost, not all the way, but you're going to go as if you were going back to Egypt. And your children, who you said were going to get plundered, they're the ones that are going to go into the land. Yeah, I don't know whether you have had this experience, but some people I know have been really confused about why the people wandered in the desert for so long. Like, did they get lost? Did they not know the way? But it wasn't anything to do with that. God led them, and they disobeyed him, or they didn't trust him. And so therefore, the wandering in the desert for 40 years is a punishment. It is God giving them what they asked for, to die in the wilderness. What they thought was better, God is just going to say, okay, that's what you want, that's what you get. And so the men who brought up the bad report, so in verse 37, the spies, so 10 of the spies, they actually die immediately. And then there's a bunch that just think, okay, we made a mistake. In chapter, keep going, verse 40. Here we are, we made a mistake, they mourned. We will go up into the place the Lord has promised because we've sinned. So they realise they've done the wrong thing. They realise they haven't trusted God, but they're still not listening. Because God said, yeah, now's not the time. You're not going to go in now. And they try to, Moses says, don't go up. God isn't with you. And they try and they get defeated. So interestingly, in the book of Numbers, you get history and then you get bits of laws on how to deal with different situations. I think it's important that they're not, we just think, oh, I don't understand why this is in this spot. Like, why is he going back to the laws? But if we look at what is emphasized after these sinful episodes, it's God's mercy, because what is he talking about here in chapter 15? After their sinfulness, the need for sacrifice. And so they're reminded about what happens when you sin and how can you get forgiveness. And so you read about the offerings that they need to offer, and you get to verse 26 in chapter 15, and it says, all the congregation of the people of Israel shall be forgiven. So the way to be forgiven for sin is to repent and offer the sacrifices that are going to provide for forgiveness. And so it also provides the antidote to grumbling. What's the antidote to grumbling? Worshipping God, recognizing his goodness and his faithfulness and his provision is the antidote to grumbling. And so God reminds them of who they are, what he has done, how they are like forgiven through his mercy and grace, that they are his people, and that he is with them. And it's just like this pictures of grace, even though we see them as like repetitions of law, they're actually pictures of grace in between all these outbreaking of disobedience and grumbling. Then we've got more rebellion and more forgiveness. And so basically, the rest of the book of Numbers is about them wandering in the wilderness. You kind of skip over 40 years, because by the chapter 20, we've got Miriam dying. And then in chapter 20, again, still in chapter 20. So in chapter 20, we've got significant people dying. We've got Miriam, and then we've got Aaron dying. And so, but essentially, these are almost, not quite, but almost the last of that generation to die. They're the first of the very significant people of that generation to die. And then we start seeing a change. And we get that Israel, this new generation, starts to destroy. So in chapter 21, from 21 to the end, they start defeating enemies. And so they're not just wandering around in the land anymore, they're defeating enemies. And then we have this interesting situation there. They are, God has brought them back to a place where they're going to be at the edge of the land again, ready to enter. And while they're in this place ready to enter, we have this interesting situation from chapter 22 to 24 of Balak and Balaam. And this is a story about a king who has seen the destruction of these two kings in chapter 21 and is scared. And basically what he wants to do is to curse Israel. So he gets the prophet for hire, or he's basically a pagan prophet that works for money. And what he wants to do is he wants to take him to a place where he can curse Israel so that they will not conquer his land. So we get this picture of God protecting his people from this spiritual attack of this prophet, or this so-called prophet, because he's not actually God's prophet. And even though he actually does speak God's words, he doesn't actually take them to heart or believe them. So he pronounces God's words over the people, and he doesn't curse them. In fact, he can't. He just blesses them time and time again. And you would think if you had that experience where you were told to do something by a king and you were going to get a lot of money for it, and then the people that you were going to curse, you just couldn't do it because a superior being stopped you. You might actually think, oh, well, I might be on the wrong side here. Maybe if this people are blessed, shouldn't I join them? But in the end, we find that Balaam stays with the enemies of God. And but he does pronounce some very important things that are very similar to what we see at the end of Genesis. We see him almost recounting the promises to Abraham, and he even points forward to Jesus. He talks about the king in verse in chapter 24, verse 7. It's talking about Israel, and he's talking about water flowing from his buckets, that God's already provided them water in the wilderness, and his seed shall be in many waters. The king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. So there's this picture of the king that's coming out of Israel. And then down in chapter 24, verse 17, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel and crush the forehead of Moab. So we get these pictures of star and a scepter, that's anticipating the king, and crushing the head. Where are all those images that we've seen before about seed and crushing heads? Yeah. So we get all these pictures from this prophet that's actually not even godly man about the future for Israel, and it just points to what God is going to do in the future, not just immediately with God's people going into the land, but much further ahead, anticipating the Messiah or the promised seed. So right at the end of Numbers, we have a new census, and basically it's almost like a repetition of the first chapters, where again all the people, all the males over the age of 20 are counted, and interestingly, it's almost the same number of people. So in spite of their rebellion and the fact that all these generations were killed in the desert, God has still got a people ready to enter into the land. And these were the children that 40 years ago, that generation said they're going to get captured and be plundered. These are now those children. And this generation is now ready and poised at the edge of promised land, ready to go in. So that's how Numbers basically finishes. You get this in chapter 33. You get recounting of all their travels, and some promises about anticipating what it's going to be like in the land. And then in chapter 34, they're actually given a picture of the boundaries of where their land's going to be. So it's almost like God is saying, you're here, you're ready to enter in, and it's like I've already given it to you. We can already divide it up. It's anticipating the fact that they're already going to get that land because God has already given it to them. They actually haven't physically got it yet, which reminds us of God's promises to us, that, you know, we are already seated with him in the heavenly places. We are already, God has already given us our inheritance, but we haven't got it yet. And it's like that at the end of Numbers. They've already been given the land. They've already virtually divided it up, but they're still not there yet. But God has promised that he will do it, and they're trusting that he will. So that we have a new generation ready to trust God and go into the land. So basically, Numbers is this tension of what it looks like to be God's people living in his presence and trusting in his promises. We see what happens when you step outside of that and you don't trust God. But you also get a picture of his mercy and his grace and his forgiveness, in spite of the stubbornness of the people. So basically that's Numbers. Any thoughts or questions?
Reading it for itself, when they were living in flesh, it's hard to see like the Israelites keep doing so much wrong. Like, it's like they're just not learning at any of these points.
Yeah, it feels like they're not. I'm sure they must do. But when we read the New Testament, and the Apostle Paul said, the things that were written here are for our instruction, then maybe, you know, the value of what's happening here is actually for us. That we can learn what was going on there and apply it to us. So yeah, it feels like they didn't learn, but the whole point is that someone's got to learn from it. And well, Paul does say that it's for our instruction. So we should be learning from that. This is why it's important to study it, because it's there so that we can learn from it. They keep failing. Jesus didn't fail, and we have the power of his spirit. So if we can look back and go, this is what they did wrong, then we ask God to help us not to do what they did. We just talked about that. At the end of this chapter, there's a question. It says, Numbers is about the journey of the people of God to their promised rest, and lists some of the reasons for the failure of virtually all who left Egypt to reach their destination, and what comparisons and warnings can be drawn for Christians in their pilgrimage towards the heavenly rest. What was the biggest reason for their failure? What was the main thing that they didn't do? It wasn't actually about failing to follow the law, was it? It was actually about failing to trust
it was
God.
just, it was just a lot of complaining, not to God. Like, were just never content.
Hmm,
They always had something
yeah.
rather than going to the
Mm,
about it. It's like,
yeah. Yeah. So it makes sense that in the New Testament, there's a lot of talk about contentment. In spite of difficult circumstances. Yeah. Because the New Testament is teaching us to learn from this.
Chapter 31, there's a part where it says, there's like a subheading that says dividing the spoils.
Mhm.
What is that in relation to?
Okay. Let's double check. I don't have that in there.
Okay, it's verse 25, chapter 31.
Okay, so after what happened with this false prophet or this so-called prophet Balaam, basically, because he couldn't curse Israel, God wouldn't allow that. He basically made an agreement with the king of Midian, so to trick Israel. And so he said, we'll just get the guys to come and worship the Midianite gods. So send out the Midianite women who are the temple prostitutes and seduce them. And God will basically be angry with his people and he'll destroy. You won't have to do anything. And essentially that is kind of what happened, but God didn't destroy all of Israel. And then after that happened, they did go to war against this nation. So he didn't get the protection he thought he would get. And they do go to war against him. Balaam is killed. And then, so they take a whole lot of plunder.
Right.
And so then they divide that up. And it just shows the provision that God gives them, that they are able to give so much back to God. So they get all of these animals, which is probably something they actually haven't really had when they've been out in the desert. And they're able to maybe take some of these animals for, to be able to start up their own, programs to multiply, sheep and goats and stuff. But it's significant that they give a portion of that to God. They dedicate to God a portion of all of that they take. So they're remembering that God is the one who's given them this, and so therefore it belongs to him, and so they actually give back to God. And they divide it around the people and to the Levites. And significantly in verse 49, we hear that when they've gone against these people, they say to Moses, your servants have counted the men of war who are under our command, and there is not a man missing from us. So they were actually able to, by God's power, destroy God's enemies and not lose a single person. So God protects them and watches over them as they do that. So these victories that they get at the end of Numbers, these are still not in the land yet. So they're still on the other side of the Jordan. And so there are some people who end up deciding not to go into the land, but you see that in Deuteronomy. And so that instead of choosing to go into the land and wait for that, they say, we like this land, we will be here. And then, so a couple of tribes decide to settle outside the land, which is, I think, symbolic of not wanting to participate in the true, like the true goodness of what God has promised. It's almost like, oh, well, we'll settle for here, but it's actually not the best. So it's kind of sad at the same time. Like it's almost like it anticipates what's going to happen. So, you know, these victories that they get before they go into the land is like a promise. What's happened here is definitely going to happen in the land. But they weren't to settle for that. They were meant to all go to the land. Yeah. And then there's this other question. Might be worth exploring. What aspects of God's character and of his relation to Israel are associated with this cloud of glory in Numbers? So,
Is it the cloud over the?
yeah, the cloud over there, the cloud that came into the tabernacle, the cloud that is leading them through the desert. So, yeah. What aspects of God's character and of his relationship to Israel are associated with the cloud? We did explore that a little bit when we looked at chapter 10, or 9:15 to 23, and then 10, the end of chapter 10. So first thing, what does the cloud symbolize?
God's presence.
Yeah, okay. And so what aspects of God's character then can we see with this presence of this cloud?
Well, he wants to be with his people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's protecting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. He surrounds and protects them. Yeah.
He commands them. It's like mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so they are, it's God who's leading them, and they're listening and obeying.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in these chapters, in the beginning of Numbers, we're presented with an ideal picture. And the ideal picture is they are going to listen and follow and feel and know that safety and protection of the Lord, who is going before them, who is providing for them as they wander around. I mean, it's actually not very far that they actually have to wander initially. It was only a couple of, you know, most a few weeks between Sinai and getting to the edge of the promised land. And even in those couple of weeks, they just start complaining. And again, the reminder is God has always provided for them. And you know, you kind of think if they experience being hungry or thirsty again, wouldn't they think, oh, well, we've experienced this before, this is what God did. Then maybe we don't need to complain. What we need to do is say, God, can you do what you did before? And provide for us. I think this idea of the cloud also, we see it in the New Testament. When Jesus was ascended, he was taken into a cloud. Like, that's not just a cloud, it's actually the same word as this presence of God cloud. And then when it talks about him returning, he will be coming back with trumpets. So this idea of that Jesus is in God's presence and he will come back in God's presence and will bring God's presence to us. We need to think about also, how Jesus helps us understand this, and it's he who enables God's presence now for us. And a lot of the symbolism in these festivals and feasts that they celebrated, Jesus sets them in the light. So they had the Passover, we now have the Lord's Supper. Jesus enables us to see how he has inaugurated a new covenant. We have Pentecost that aligns with the Feast of Weeks, I think it is. That is where the first fruits of the kingdom are shown, and then we hear these trumpets. There's this festival with the trumpets, and I think we're waiting for that one because that's where Jesus back when we do the trumpets. These pictures that we get here anticipate what's going to happen when Jesus comes. What has already been inaugurated and what we are waiting. Anyway, that's it for this term, and so we won't be meeting until the end of May. No, April. End of April.
Yeah.
So it's 3 weekends of holiday. So the 9th, 16th, so we went meeting again on the 30th of April. And my hope is that we'll get through all of Deuteronomy, all of the main things that that we want to that the last 2 units in that one session. And then that will leave you then free to explore anything extra that you want to talk about. And so the following week, basically we'll just recap. I guess, you want to be preparing, you're going to do the exam to do that. And so just ask whatever questions you want about the course material in preparation for the exam. So that's the plan.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you very much, Shirley.
That's all right.